change in agricultural policies and the phase out of 통일 rice.
Hello, this is Tae-ho Kim, the instructor of the course Green Revolution in Korea. In this segment, we will examine the decline of 통일 rice in South Korea and its persistence despite government withdrawal of support. We will analyze regional differences in its adoption, the role of government procurement programs, and how economic geography shaped rice preferences. Additionally, we will explore the rise of akibare rice, the branding of Japonica rice as king's rice, and the lasting impact on Korea's rice market. Although the Chun Doo-han administration withdrew official support for 통일 rice, the variety remained in cultivation for nearly a decade. By the 1980s, 통일 rice cultivation had significantly declined, shrinking to one-third of its peak area in 1978 and about half the area cultivated in 1977 or 79. Nevertheless, 통일-type varieties still occupied 20 to 30% of total rice paddy area throughout the decade. Although the absence of the authoritarian policies of the Yushin regime led to a decline in forced cultivation, farmers did not immediately abandon 통일 rice altogether. The phase-out of 통일 rice was driven primarily by state policies. By the early 1990s, excessive government stockpiling led to financial burdens, prompting policy shifts to phase out 통일 rice in favor of premium Japonica varieties. The restructuring of government procurement programs accelerated this decline. On one hand, to reduce the financial burden on the government, and on the other hand, to comply with the World Trade Organization's market liberalization policies, the grain purchase system has been continuously scaled back. With government subsidies withdrawn, farmers found it increasingly unprofitable to continue growing 통일 rice. Additionally, as South Korea's economy developed and incomes rose, consumers became more willing to pay higher prices for Japonica rice, further diminishing the demand for 통일 rice. From 1987, the Ministry of Agriculture ceased designating new 통일-type varieties as government-recommended crops, and in 1991, all previously designated 통일-type varieties were removed from the approved list. Furthermore, in 1991, the government allowed farmers to switch from 통일 rice to Japonica varieties without reducing their procurement quota. And in 1992, government purchases of 통일 rice ceased entirely.
Regional disparities in rice adoption. Climate.
As previously reviewed, 통일 rice was at the center of various controversies during its promotion. Therefore, the historical fact that the cultivation of 통일 rice ceased in 1992 raises an intriguing question. If 통일 rice was so unpopular, how did it manage to be cultivated for another 15 years, even after the downfall of the Yushin regime? To answer this, it is essential to recognize that the popularity of 통일 rice varied by region. Statistics show that 통일 rice dominated the southern provinces but faced significant resistance in central regions such as Gyeonggi province. 통일 rice briefly surpassed the Japonica varieties in Gyeonggi province only in 1978, owing to an enormous push from the government. In contrast, South Jeolla province had been an early adopter of 통일 rice since 1972 and remained loyal even after the fall of the Yushin regime in 1979. Especially considering that Jeolla provinces were the region that was the most devastated by the Nopung incident, it looks surprising that farmers in that area opted for Tongil rice until the mid-1990s. Climate conditions and economic geography played crucial roles in shaping these regional differences. The Tongil type varieties were developed by adapting high-yield indica strains to grow in South Korea. While they exhibited greater cold tolerance than their tropical parent varieties, they still thrive more effectively in warmer regions such as Jeolla and Gyeongsang provinces. In southern Korea, where spring and autumn temperatures were relatively mild, Tongil rice established itself with fewer complications. However, expanding its cultivation into Gyeonggi province and other central regions proved far more challenging. Memoirs of farmers in the Gyeonggi region reveal that there were frequent complaints about Tongil varieties' vulnerability to cold damage. In an effort to increase Tongil rice adoption in Central Korea, the Rural Development Administration invested heavily in the development of new Tongil type varieties suited to the region's climate. One of the most prominent among these was the Yushin rice, which was introduced as the upgraded successor to Tongil rice. However, as previously mentioned, Yushin rice failed in its debut year, leading to its swift abandonment. This failure had unintended consequences, as farmers in Gyeonggi province, who had already been skeptical of Tongil rice, became even more committed to Japonica varieties, further entrenching regional disparities in rice cultivation preferences.
Regional disparities in rice adoption, market accessibility.
Beyond ecological factors, economic geography played a role in shaping regional adoption patterns. The economic geography of Tongil rice depended on farmers' accessibility to the market. Due to its low popularity, Tongil rice was traded at significantly lower prices in the market compared to the ordinary rice, which referred to Japonica varieties. In an effort to promote the cultivation of Tongil rice, the government utilized the procurement program as previously mentioned. Consequently, by the mid to late 1970s, almost the entire grain procurement volume consisted of Tongil rice. Effectively, cooperative farmers engaged in contract farming of Tongil rice as partners with the state. However, not all farmers welcomed the de facto contract farming arrangement with the state. If they could gain greater economic benefits outside of the state-controlled system, farmers sometimes chose external opportunities despite various political burdens. In the case of cultivating Japonica varieties, the visible yield could be smaller, but higher market prices would compensate for the lower productivity and eventually make it more profitable. Farmers also had the freedom to dispose of their harvest without waiting for government purchases. Particularly with economic growth, consumer demand for high-quality rice such as akibare increased, and more favorable conditions for farmers could be found in the market. Furthermore, the government's suggested purchase rice for rice was consistently criticized for being insufficient. Therefore, if alternative sales channels outside of government purchases could be secured, there was no need to rely solely on government grain purchases and cultivate Tongil rice. In the Honam region, where no large consumer markets were nearby and rice had been undervalued since the Japanese colonial period, it was rational to rely on the state's administrative apparatus, which implemented various preferential policies. In contrast, the Gyeonggi region was adjacent to Seoul, the largest consumer market, and had already gained a reputation as a production area for premium rice. Thus, for Gyeonggi farmers, it was more profitable to trade with private wholesalers offering higher prices for akibare than to deal with the government. Rice wholesalers in the Gyeonggi region attempted private contract farming by employing practices such as advance sale of rice in the field for popular varieties like akibare.
Akibare and the invented tradition of king's rice.
With the collapse of the Yushin regime and the abolition of pro-Tongil state policies, both producers and consumers rapidly adjusted to the new circumstances. By the late 1970s, as urban incomes rose significantly, there was an explosive increase in demand for Gyeonggi rice, particularly among affluent urban consumers. By 1979, reports emerged of wealthy individuals contracting the cultivation of pesticide-free rice and nearly twice the government standard purchase price, sparking criticism in the media. In 1983, the market witnessed the ordinary rice crisis, where prices of Japonica rice surged by nearly 30% during the winter, even as the price of government rice, mainly Tongil rice, declined. This consumer preference for Japonica rice was particularly centered on akibare. Its sellers effectively merged the growing preference for Japonica rice with the historical prestige of Gyeonggi rice, citing historical records that the rice produced in Gyeonggi province was offered to Joseon kings. The resulting Gyeonggi rice boom further provoked consumers' desire for premium quality rice to the extent that some consumers actively sought out American quality rice smuggled out of the US military base in Seoul. This Gyeonggi rice boom is particularly intriguing in that it was a modern construction, blending historical prestige and modern consumers' demand. It is true that a specific rice called jache from Icheon and Yeoju County, Gyeonggi Province, was indeed historically presented as tribute to the royal court. However, by the time Japanese colonial authorities collected and documented native Korean rice varieties in the 1920s, these traditional strains had already disappeared. Moreover, the term jache predates modern biological taxonomy and may refer to either a specific group of rice varieties or simply a descriptive term rather than a distinct cultivar. Although it had no connection whatsoever to historical Korean rice strains, akibare wore the crown of the premium Gyeonggi rice. Neither consumers nor merchant questions akibare's appropriation of the name king's rice. During the period of state-mandated Tongil rice cultivation, the government had actively sought to eliminate akibare while farmers resisted such measures and persisted in cultivating it despite state pressure. This struggle against government intervention became, in retrospect, a badge of honor, reinforcing the perception that akibare was an exceptional rice variety. It is no coincidence, therefore, that Korea's first officially trademarked brand name rice, King's rice or 임금님 쌀, registered in 1995 was akibare grown in Icheon, Gyeonggi Province. Even today, akibare and its improved variant, 새추청, which means new akibare, remain among the most popular rice varieties in South Korea's consumer market.
The stigma of government rice and struggles of Jeolla rice.
Meanwhile, rice from Jeolla provinces suffered from its historical association with Tongil rice. Although Jeolla provinces also known as the Honam region, had spearheaded Tongil rice cultivation and played a leading role in the Green Revolution, they also inherited the negative market perception of Tongil rice. Historically, Honam has been Korea's premier grain-producing region, yet its rice has not always been highly valued for quality. As Honam produced more rice than it consumed, a significant portion of its yield was transported to Seoul and other regions. Prior to modernization, the lack of reliable storage and transportation technologies meant that rice exported from Honam suffered quality deterioration compared to rice that was consumed locally or that traveled a shorter distance, just like the case of Gyeonggi rice. During the Japanese colonial period, the Government General of Korea positioned Honam as a supplier of high-volume, low-cost rice to both Korea and Japan. Given this market structure, Honam rice was evaluated more for its affordability than its quality, a perception that persisted long after Korea's liberation in 1945. Even after Korea's independence, the perception of Honam rice did not improve significantly. As the government remained focused on increasing production, discussions about rice quality were largely sidelined. Moreover, Honam rice continued to play a key role in stabilizing national rice prices, functioning as a market benchmark for the lowest tier rice prices. The introduction of Tongil rice exacerbated these pre-existing negative perceptions of Honam rice. As noted earlier, Honam's economic geography made it more dependent on government policies than private markets, further reinforcing the association between Honam and Tongil rice in public memory. Government rice stockpiles, often consisting of Tongil rice stored for up to 5 years, were distributed at reduced prices for public institutions and military rations, reinforcing the idea that government rice was of a lower quality. Thus, Honam's long-standing reputation as a bulk rice supplier, compounded by the legacy of Tongil rice, shaped consumer perceptions in ways that continue to influence regional disparities in the Korean rice market. Even as rice production and branding strategies have evolved after the 1980s, the historical memory of Tongil rice continues to affect Korea's agricultural economy and consumer preferences today.